Right, we get into this conversation now. Would moving Eskom to the Energy Department yield any positive results? Also, considering, of course, latest development around the decision by NERSA to approve 18.65% increase of Eskom's electricity cost price. To help us in that conversation tonight, Hilton Trollip, independent consultant in energy research. We're joined by Pieba, I beg your pardon, Modikwe, EFF Member of Parliament, Thabiso Tenyane, energy expert, and Dr. Dion George, DA parliamentary member, as well as Dawie Roodt, the Efficient Group Chief Economist. Good evening to you all, and thank you very much for your time and joining us today for this conversation. Pieba, let me begin with you. A statement from the economic freedom fighters saying the rolling blackouts will continue escalating regardless of whether the Eskom falls under whatever department. Why do you believe nothing will change, even though you do support the move?
Thank you so much, and greetings to your viewers. The reality is, of course, it has been, by the way, a call of the EFF that the Department of Public Enterprises must be closed altogether, and that all those state entities must be taken to the departments that they directly report to, particularly that Eskom as well must come to the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, because energy, of course, is that department. But the reality as well is that whether we like it or not, we have seen the trends. We have also seen the conversations around how government is responding to the issue of the energy crisis, which is that there isn't really anything that is coherent that is happening. So just merely moving Eskom from one department to another does not necessarily mean that it is going to change anything. There needs to be other things that need to be taken. The EFF had made a number of submissions over the years, which up until now have not been taken into account, and which were of the view that had they been taken into account, or would they be taken into account, they would actually assist in terms of dealing with the issue of load shedding. Currently, the responses that we are having, like now, today, we've had an issue of an electricity hike, which does not assist at all. If anything, it burdens the poor and the people who cannot afford even further. So that is where we are right now, that just moving the department together to mineral resources or moving Eskom to mineral resources without actually putting in the measures in place to make sure that Eskom as an entity is able to provide electricity, and it is actually maintained to be a public enterprise, as opposed to what is happening right now, where we all know and we see that the unbundling process or the unbundling procedure that is being put on Eskom is really there so that Eskom, number one, underperforms, and there is a very good case for the state to actually move for privatization, which is something that we do not want. So for as long as there is that attempt to privatize Eskom, to bring in IPPs, and to give the responsibility of energy regulation to IPPs more than Eskom as a public entity, then we are not actually going to go anywhere, and we are not actually going to get proper energy generation.
All right, Gabi, much appreciated. Hilton, let's bring you in here. The ANC resolving in its conference that specified state companies operating in specific economic sectors should be overseen by relevant government departments. Why do you think that is such a bad idea when it comes to Eskom falling under the energy department?
Tabu, good evening to you and good evening to the colleagues on the panel. No reasoning has been put forward for this decision. It just came out of left field, out of the ANC policy conference. And the ANC policy conference, as we all saw, was hardly the kind of a process where such a major decision could be taken. And no evidence came out of the policy conference of the conversations and discussions where people motivated for this change. On the other hand, South Africa has, over the years, in its constitutional democracy, established the separation of powers between Parliament, the executive, the judiciary, the national prosecuting authority, etc. And the separation of powers is a very advanced idea in the history of humankind.
Yeah.
And it has been shown by giving different roles to different role players, one gets much better outcomes for a free society where innovation and inclusion and everybody's ideas can be used, than a society where you just have a king and everybody must do what the king does. In other words, no separation.
So if I get a sense what you're saying, this idea is being shoved down our throats without any proper reasoning. I mean, there's been a number of reasons that have been given. One of them being that the current situation is such that the oversight is really falling on two entities, and you'd find one, for example, saying coal and nothing else, and you find one saying IPPs, and therefore this creates uncertainty in as far as where should this entity go, because you have an energy minister, Gwede Mantashe, who is really pro-coal, and you have a public enterprises minister who is Pravin Gordhan, who was, of course, pushing the processes towards more renewable energy. So this is the kind of disjoint that many have been saying it needs to be fixed and sorted out.
Well, Thabo, this is precisely what we want to avoid, where we have big men with opposing ideas fighting against each other, and as each big man gets more power, he takes over, and that idea then becomes the order of the day. We don't have institutional continuity and the design of institutions, which we've done very carefully in our institutional democracy. And it's precisely these big men that are breaking down the rule of law and the institutions in our constitutional democracy. Yeah. I don't think we should be speaking about Gwede Mantashe as a personality who interferes in another ministry outside of the role that the law actually gives to him. The law actually prescribes that the Department of Minerals and Energy and the Energy Minister should procure energy, not manage Eskom. But they're not procuring energy, which is why we don't have new generation on the grid, and they're interfering. And so what we have is a fight between fundamental ideologies inside the ANC. And this is playing out and paralyzing our government, because we have what's called cascading political appointments, where from the top we get from the RET side and then from the constitutionalists and the mixed government side, getting filtered into every government department and every SOE at every level. And so they continue to fight against each other. And the problem in South Africa is paralysis of SOEs. And it's not just Eskom, and it's for the same reason. Transnet, Fret, is falling to pieces for no reason other than we have the same anti-privatization, pro-privatization factions in the ANC fighting. And we have agreed to have a mixed economy where we have SOEs and we also have private entities. And if you have people coming in that are against the private sector or against the SOEs, and they fight for that in an ideological way, we just go back to pre-94, where we have an ideological battle between irreconcilable ideologues.
Let's take a break. We'll continue in a moment. Get Thabiso Tenyane as well as Dr. George and Dawie Roodt to weigh in on that conversation as well. Focus continues in a moment. We're back live, and thanks for staying with us tonight on In Focus. We have still with us the independent energy analyst Hilton Trollip, BFF MP Piabi Madokwe, energy expert Thabiso Tenyane, DAMP Dr. Dion George, and Efficient Group Chief Economist Dawie Roodt. Dr. Tenyane, good evening, and thank you very much for your time. Let's bring you in here. I mean, let's look at this situation. Is this really purely an ideological battle, and a strong man has won here this time to finally get their way to take Eskom and put it at the Department of Energy? Why was Eskom put out of energy and into public enterprises to begin with?
Look, I think we shouldn't necessarily look at this decision on the basis of who are current ministers. We should then look at this decision on the basis that is the country going the right direction or not. Let us not debate as to who clashes with who in relation to energy policy. What is a situation that needs to be understood historically is The public enterprise was established at the time with an intent. In an actual fact, when the ANC took over, public enterprise was already there. The intention at the time was, as the then government did not have enough resources to advance the role at which those state-owned enterprises were playing, their intention was to put them in a department that could go look for strategic partners. But 1994, when the ANC took over, what happened then is the unions were brutally opposed to privatization. I think one of our panelists, as we started, was, as we are sitting with the crisis that we are sitting with, clearly in terms of the act and the law, as my colleague was saying, the supplier of last resort, it should be government through the utility, before you can then say we also want to put reliance on private sector. However, this is a good decision, because let me refer all of you to 2014 decision, when the process and the program of renewable was running effectively. Then Eskom decided at the time that it does not need that program because it has access power, which we don't see today. Mm-hmm. It has access power, and it was going to advance a decision of building nuclear. Until 2018, after all other initiatives failed, that program got back to normal as it is now running again. Now, the issue at hand here is we have an IRP, which I agree also with my first colleague which was talking, that intended to move to renewable and excluded Eskom as our utility outside that particular program. But at the time, the problem became that there was no ISMO. If there was ISMO, which is an independent system market operator, that problem would have not been there. So now, to be a buyer and the generator yourself, it then created conflict which has always been moved aside. But we all know that this decision has long been debated and getting parked. Even ISMO was debated, I think, 2009. But it was parked because Eskom at the time said, we cannot move on ISMO now while I want to build the new power stations.
Okay.
So we always postpone decisions.
Yeah.
2013, we debated things, they never got implemented. 2010, we debated things, they never got implemented.
Yeah.
13 years down the line.
In your sense, this move is a move in the right direction, in the sense that something that has been discussed is being implemented.
It's a proper alignment of administrative and oversight by the policy department. Let us not look at who's the minister.
All right, let's bring in Dr. George. Dr. George, many have been saying this is better alignment, better aligning them with the functions, with people who are familiar with the subject matter, and that is energy.
Well, that certainly isn't the case. It's very obvious that Eskom isn't working. The model of Eskom is broken because the lights are off. They're not delivering what they're supposed to deliver. So whether you take the department and you put it with energy or anywhere else, it still isn't going to work. There's a fundamental problem with the model, and that needs to be changed. So the DA has been saying for a long time, you need to take Eskom and you need to separate it into generation, transmission, and distribution. You need to separate those functions.
Yeah.
You need to inject the private sector, and you need to get independent energy producers into the system. Yeah. That's what you need to do.
So according to the EFF, sorry Dr. George, while you're there, EFF saying that unbundling equals underperformance, the deliberate thing to make Eskom to underperform so that you can sell it to the private sector.
Well, I have no idea what the EFF are thinking, but certainly if the idea is that, well, you have a state-owned enterprise that's going to deliver anything, that whole fundamental model is broken because we know it doesn't work. It's been tried for over 30 years now, and it still isn't working, and it isn't going to change. So the issue is that the model is wrong, and Eskom is not going to be able to deliver. In fact, it's going to get worse. there is this ideological problem between the just energy transition and coal. Now, we know that the criminal syndicates would prefer to have coal because that's where they're making a whole stack of money. And that's a large element of what's going on here. And that is possibly why various people want to kill the CEO of Eskom too. So there's a big, big problem here that we know obviously is there and needs to be fixed. So we need to change the model. That's the most important thing. And then we need to ask a couple of questions. For example, what is going to happen to the governance model of Eskom if it transfers to the energy department? So does that mean that you collapse this so-called corporatized structure? Because that's actually what happened initially, that there was resistance to privatization. So the government landed somewhere in between to corporatize these entities. So it costs a whole stack of money to pay a lot of people to do this so-called work, but there is no accountability because the taxpayers keep on having to bail this thing out. So what's going to happen to the governance model? That's the first thing. There's also an inherent conflict of interest of an entity reporting to its own regulator and the ministry that is supposed to look at competition in the sector. So that's a fundamental conflict of interest already. And then, very importantly, what about the massive mountain of Eskom's debt? Eskom says it's got about 400 billion rand in debt. Government is talking about the so-called swap of maybe 200 billion or so. But what about the other 200 billion? We know that the international investors and bondholders, creditors in particular, are very, very worried about Eskom not being able to pay its coupon on those bonds and not being able to pay back the capital because Eskom is essentially bankrupt. So government's going to guarantee maybe 200 billion. But what about the other 200 billion? So does this mean that all 400 billion is then going to be put into the national onto national debt for the taxpayers to pay, in addition to the increases in NERSA? What does it mean? Or does it mean that you collapse Eskom's corporate structure into the department and then don't pay back your bonds, so make them take a haircut? We don't know. So we must find that out. And government has been most obtuse on that. Yeah. So the fact of the matter is, where's the delivery? We're all sitting with our lights off. That's the fact. So it's not working. For example, the city of Ekurhuleni is about to introduce its independent producers into the grid. And that's what needs to happen across the country. Yeah. Because if we have to rely on government to deliver the energy, it's never going to happen. It's going to get a lot worse.
It's not working currently, Dawie Roodt. We are sitting in the dark for 6 hours to 10 hours, whatever hours, in the various stages. You are saying put this whole thing under business rescue. Doesn't matter whether it's on public enterprises or on the Department of Energy, but just put it under business rescue. Why?
Yeah, good evening to you. Well, yeah, I can think of many reasons why we should have it in one department called under Pravin Gordhan, and I can think of many reasons why it should be in a specific department, in this instance under mineral and energy. So there are many good reasons why it should be on either under the one or the other. But the reality is, Pravin Gordhan has been a disaster as a Minister of Finance. He is a disaster as a Minister of State-owned Enterprises. Dawie Roodt is a total disaster when it comes to energy and mineral affairs. So this is moving from one horrible minister to the other horrible minister. And I don't think it's really going to make any difference here. The real issue is that we have to understand that we have a crisis on our hands here, a major crisis. We have to declare some sort of emergency when it gets to Eskom. And we have to fix Eskom. And I've got news for the EFF, and that is we are in the process of privatizing Eskom. Not on a normal manner, but basically because Eskom is just pulling apart. The way that we have privatized the airways in South Africa, the way that we are currently privatizing the post office in South Africa, the way that we privatize just everything in South Africa because the state simply cannot deliver it.
I think so they're in agreement with you that there is a deliberate move towards that. That's why none of these entities are functioning the way that they're supposed to be functioning.
Yes. So the reality is that if you want any of these sort of services, you have to do it yourself. And that means in a way that the private sector have to take over. So this is what's going to happen to Eskom as well. So we need to put it in a business rescue kind of thing, which will mean that you have to take some very, very, very unpopular steps. And let me give you one example of an unpopular step. There are probably around about 10, 20,000 people that are currently on the payroll of Eskom that should not be there. You will have to fire them. That's what it means. But we have to choose between 20,000 people losing their jobs and 10 million people not be able finding a job because the economy is not growing. I can tell you this South African economy is not going to grow at 1.5% this year. Lower than the population growth in South Africa. We are heading for some serious trouble in South Africa. This is a crisis. We better make sure that we fix Eskom, which must mean that we break it into pieces. And it doesn't matter what minister is responsible. I don't think any one of these two ministers are capable of doing this. They are actually part of the problem. But we have to declare some sort of emergency, put it into business rescue, break it into pieces, get private sector participation, move the total debt of Eskom to the Minister of Finance, because he guarantees that in any event, and start from scratch. That's the only answer. Keeping on moving into whatever department is not going to make a difference. The problem here is politics. The problem is the ANC government. That's the problem.
Piabi, break it into pieces, put some private entities in there, and certainly put it on business rescue and send it on its way. What's your thought?
Is that for me?
No, that's for Piabi.
Oh.
Hello, thank you so much. I think almost everyone in this panel, I'm not saying everyone, but almost everyone is very much pro privatization. And I think all of us are agreeing that the ANC or the government in currently is failing to deal with the issues of Eskom. But it doesn't make sense that you say that we must then privatize because government is failing to do its most basic tasks. The reality is that energy generation and also energy provision for our people should be the sole responsibility or the primary responsibility of government. And therefore, it is very lazy, it is very irresponsible to actually now come and say that, no, in fact, we can't deal with Eskom, let's actually get the private sector involved. So basically, you are saying that the private sector must do the work of government. If we are all agreeing that the government is unable to do its work, then surely the most obvious thing is that then let's change government. Let's put people who actually want to service our people. Let's remove the ANC. Let us put people who want to actually do the work. And it is not true that it is only the private sector that can deal with the issue of Eskom. The reality is with Eskom, I think we've seen in a number of headlines previously that it has been saying, look, we're having an issue with energy generation. Our contractors are giving us substandard coal. The coal that they are giving us is extremely expensive. But we've always said that, look, standardize the issue of coal, for example. This is something that the EFF has said. Secondly, we said there's a state-owned entity or a state-owned mining company which has the primary responsibility of providing coal for Eskom, which is a state-owned company. But instead, Eskom will say, no, I'd rather go to the very same sluggish and fraudulent and corrupt contractors to go and procure substandard coal that is messing up our energy plants instead of using the state-owned company that has been established especially for that. Yeah. The reality is that the Eskom should also by now, they should have made sure that in addition to what is coal energy generation, made sure that there is proper just transition. And that just transition means that the state itself must have by now invested in renewable energy instead of giving that responsibility to IPPs. Because whether we like it or not, the private sector, its primary responsibility or its primary purpose is to get money. It is to make profit, which therefore means that we would not have even had this thing that NERSA must decide whether the electricity hike will be 32%. The private sector would have said, look, we're increasing by 50% and there's absolutely nothing we could have done about it. Yeah. So that we are going to take the power of energy generation or anything that has to do with the sole responsibility of the state to provide any form of service delivery and say that, no, let's take it to the to the private sector. It's not going to help our people.
All right, Piabi, let's hold it there. Dawie, you want to quickly jump in?
Yeah, please. I have to jump in here. The basic point that she's making here is that if we give it to the private sector, it's going to be much more expensive. That is absolute nonsense. Because it is very expensive electricity in South Africa. Don't look at the price of electricity. Look at all the bailouts that the taxpayer is giving to Eskom, for example. If you calculate that, you will see Eskom, the electricity in South Africa is exceptionally expensive. But that's not all. You are arguing that it's a job of a government to provide, or the state to provide the electricity, and
that
to provide it at a reasonable price.
Should be the sole responsibility of the state to provide electricity to the people.
What about education? Shouldn't that be? Don't we have the right in South Africa to have good education at a reasonable price? Don't we have the right in South Africa to have good health services at a reasonable price?
I'm sure we do.
Don't we have the right in South Africa to have good infrastructure at a reasonable price? Yes, we have the right to have all those sort of things, but we don't have it. The same with electricity. Do we have a right to have reliable, cheap electricity? Yes. So, but what do we have in South Africa? We don't have cheap. We've got expensive electricity, but we also don't have electricity. Arguing that electricity should be cheap, but you can't get it, it's a simple argument. It's a stupid argument. It sounds like the Soviet Union. Everything was cheap, you just couldn't get it. But if you look at the food provisions in South Africa, food is a good price in South Africa because the private sector provides that. If you want an electrician in South Africa, you can get that at a good price. If you want a builder, you can get it at a good price.
All right,
if you want any of these private sector things, you can get it at a good price.
Let's get the other gentleman to come in. Tata Tenyane, please unmute there for us.
Yeah. Look, guys, talking about the ideological approach that we could have to this current crisis won't necessarily assist us in engaging. I think I would have been supporting every speaker here, and I don't think that our colleague Dawie should be aggressive in this particular response. Maybe he's passionate about it. Now, guys, rather we say the state of the affairs we are sitting with here requires South Africans to stop and say, what plan do we require to move forward? I think the actions of the president last July and recently, it's a reflection that the two ministries are not functioning. When you hear a president saying, I'm presenting an energy plan, you must understand something somewhere is not working. That is why the president says that. Now, I'm encouraging all the panelists here to be saying there are two things we need as South Africa. Either we declare energy as a crisis now, electricity in particular, or we declare unemployment as the crisis. I would probably move for the latter, and these are my reasons. If we declare unemployment as a crisis, therefore then, in solving that particular crisis of employment, you are going to require intensive industries that can be able to absorb this unemployment. And immediately identify those industries, you are going to realize that you have insufficient electricity to supply to those industries. Therefore, then you will then be forced to change the procurement process of South Africa. Because with COVID, we're able to change regulations as fast as possible and make sure that we move very fast in then mitigating that particular situation. Why can't we do it with energy? So therefore then, bold decisions must be taken if South Africa is to come out of this quagmire. And the process is very simple. We need to declare one of those as a crisis and be able to then agree, all of us. Because with renewable, let's state it in terms here. Even if we're saying Western Cape and Eastern Cape has wind, there is insufficient transmission lines that can be able to evacuate that. Even if we say there is irradiation that is higher in the Northern Cape, that lines are now congested. So therefore then, we're finding ourselves in a situation that because Eskom doesn't have enough resources, who's going to be building this transmission line in order to evacuate the endowment that this country is having? So let's not deal with ideological approaches. Let's say all of us agree that the cost of unserved electricity now, excluding cost to business, is sitting over 500 billion. If we can add business and businesses that are closing and all other losses that we are having, We are by far over $1 trillion. And it's going to take this country more than another probably 20 years to come out of this particular situation. Sure. Unless we speak as South Africans collectively and tell the president to declare unemployment as a crisis before we have social unrest.
All right, Tenyane, let's hold it there. Hilton?
Thanks. So I'm amused because exactly what is happening in the ANC government happened on this panel. One person argues for private, the other one argues against private. And then one person argues for renewables and one wants coal. The fact is that every successful country in the world, every successful constitutional democracy, government does certain things. What it does very well is it runs transmission grids and distribution grids. What the private sector does very well, builds power stations and operates power stations. What government does very well, it regulates power stations so they don't pollute, so that there's fair competition. It ensures competition. And this is the beauty of our constitutional democracy. We have built the legal structures and the institutions to run a transmission grid by Eskom, to run effective IPP procurement. We've shown that we can do it. But what's happening is some ideologues are becoming more powerful than the others. So I will just end up by saying I think the current trajectory is that the Minerals and Energy Minister, with private advisors outside of government policy processes, has decided pro-coal, pro-nuclear, and against renewables, and he is making the Energy Department not work to procure IPPs, and he is interfering with the oversight of Eskom, which can be done by the DPE, except it can't be done when there's this powerful fight going on inside the ANC between private and anti-private and renewables versus coal, and that has to be sorted out inside the ANC, that we will have renewables and we'll have coal. We'll have private and we'll have government, and they will do it inside a rule of law institutional framework which we have set up over the past 20 years and which I believe can be made to work. Yeah. We don't have to pull down the whole temple because things aren't working. Because there's a massive crisis, we don't have to decide, well, we won't have democracy or we won't have this. We have to make what we've got work, not fight and destroy it.
Dr. George, you have under 2 minutes.
What government is doing?
Yes, go for it.
What government is doing is making itself rich at the expense of South Africans. That's what it's doing. It's destroying business in South Africa and it's destroying lives because it is so greedy and because it's got entrepreneurs that have captured the system and it's not going to get uncaptured. And what is going to happen is you are going to have a privatized system, because what individual people are doing is they're getting their own inverters, they're getting off the grid, and business is going to find a technology that can keep it powered. And then government will not have a role actually in the process. Like with education, like with healthcare, like with everything else that government is supposed to do and is unable to do. That's what's going to happen. So instead of your big state sitting at the center doing incompetent things that will destroy the economy, you're going to find that people are going to go on their own and they're going to get their own power and they're going to bypass government. Government will get less tax in and it will become smaller and smaller and smaller. That's what's going to happen. So inadvertently, your socialist model is going to die and your developmental state, plan of the developmental state will die, and it will become a much more libertarian situation because of what government has done. That is the irony of what is happening here. So it is not all doom and gloom, but what is if government does not restructure Eskom soon, that's going to happen. It's going to lose control actually of the power generation in South Africa. And in fact, that's going to be a great day. And you're going to find cities in South Africa, they're going to find solutions that are going to get off the grid, and then they're never going to pay a cent to Eskom and they'll never get a penny from it. That's what is going to happen. So government must get its act together, or must understand what the consequences are going to be.
Completely out of time,
that
gentlemen.
Paradise is not going to happen.
Let's leave it there, unfortunately, because of time. Thank you very much for coming on. That is independent energy analyst Hilton Trollip, EFF MP, PRB, Madokwe, energy expert Thabiso Tenyane, DAMP, Dr. Dion George, and efficient group chief economist Dawie Roodt.